Some years before the composition of Pictures at an Exhibition, Moussorgsky wrote to his teacher, Balakireff, as follows: "You know I have always been a cosmopolitan, but now I have undergone a sort of rebirth. I have been brought near to everything Russian." This patriotism of Moussorgsky's was a trait shared by a great number of composers in almost every country. The great impulse of the time in all the arts was nationalism. The spirit of Norway, for example, is musically reflected by Grieg. The nationalistic movement was particularly strong in Bohemia, as illustrated in this Slavonic dance by Dvorak. Even in Germany, the stronghold of traditionalism, the nationalist movement found expression as in the forest horn calls of Weber's Der Freischütz. In Russian music, nationalism was most powerfully represented by a circle of composers who called themselves the Five. Besides Moussorgsky and his teacher Balakireff, the group included Rimsky-Korsakov. Here is an example of his music. Also, Cesar Cui, somewhat more of an amateur than the others. And Borodin, here is an example of his music. There are two primary sources upon which these five composers drew. First, Russian folk songs, and second, ancient Russian liturgical music. To begin with, let us investigate the way Moussorgsky used folk-like elements for his own purposes in Pictures at an Exhibition. The composition opens like this. Now listen to a very familiar Russian folk song. That phrase from the Volga Boatman's song is based on 3 tones. The first 3 notes of Moussorgsky's tune create a similar pattern. Moussorgsky then goes on to a similar pattern in another register. The common characteristic of all these note groups from the Volga Boatman's song and Pictures at an Exhibition is that within the interval of a fourth, they include a small skip and a step. Another feature of Russian folk music, exemplified by the Volga Boatman's song, is repetition. Notice also that it keeps returning to that lowest tone. This is also true of the passage that opened Pictures at an Exhibition. To put all this into perspective, listen once again to that opening passage as it sounds in performance. Now we have repetition. The second ingredient of Russian nationalism, so brilliantly represented by Moussorgsky, is, as I mentioned before, the old liturgical music of the country. The chants used in the Russian Orthodox Church were made of short melodic groups called ekhoi. These always remained the same individually, but could be strung together in a great variety of combinations. The effect frequently resembled folk music. Here is a typical example. Here another ekhoi begins. Rimsky-Korsakov based his Russian Easter Overture on chants of this kind. Moussorgsky invented a similar tune for the last tableau of Pictures at an Exhibition. This is called The Great Gate at Kiev. In its full orchestral dress, it emerges as follows. You will recall it from the beginning of this discussion. Another portion of the Great Gate at Kiev also suggests the chanting of Orthodox monks. Before passing to a closer examination of pictures at an exhibition, perhaps it is well to mention one of the forerunners in Russia of the musical nationalism we have been discussing. The father of this school was Mikhail Glinka, who was active a generation or so before Moussorgsky. Glinka's first opera, A Life for the Tsar, paved the way for all later developments. The last act of this work contains an episode called Slavskaya, or Glorification, which strongly resembles the Great Gate of Kiev episode which you heard. In opposition to the nationalistic school, we find Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky wrote in a more non-national Western style than did the five, whom he actively opposed. This finely wrought theme from his Fifth Symphony will illustrate the point. Nevertheless, Tchaikovsky frequently used folk material in his works, a fact that has led Igor Stravinsky, in his Poetics of Music, to remark that, however attentive and sensitive Tchaikovsky was to the world outside of Russia, one can say that he generally showed himself to be, if not a nationalist and populist like the five, at least profoundly national in the character of his themes, the cut of his phrases, and the rhythmic physiognomy of his work. The opening of Tchaikovsky's Second Symphony is an excellent illustration of the nationalist, the purely Russian side of Tchaikovsky's musical nature. The music of all these composers had important later repercussions, and through Stravinsky, who was a pupil of Rimsky-Korsakov, this influence extends to music written in our time. Stravinsky's own musical nationalism, only one of the many paths followed by this great composer, probably finds its most attractive expression in the Russian dance from his ballet, Petrushka. Probably the best Russian composer during the present Soviet regime has been Sergei Prokofiev, whose work at times reflects a certain nationalism and thus is worth quoting for comparison. His Lieutenant Kizha suite contains a movement called Troika, which pictures a ride in the three-horse Russian sleigh of that name, and will illustrate the point. With all these considerations as a background, let us now examine Moussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. The work was composed as a memorial to Moussorgsky's friend Victor Hartmann. Hartmann was a Russian architect, designer, and painter who was taken up in the same patriotic ferment that produced the Five, and also, incidentally, such literary giants as Gogol, Turgenev, and Dostoevsky. Moussorgsky's composition described a retrospective exhibition of Hartmann's work held a year after Hartmann's death, and includes musical impressions of several of his drawings and paintings, tied together by a recurrent episode called Promenade. This last is a visualization of the spectator at the show, and Moussorgsky wrote to a friend that one could see his own, Moussorgsky's, physiognomy in the heavy rhythms of this passage. The composer was not slim. At any rate, Pictures at an Exhibition opens with this promenade theme. I think you will recognize it from our earlier discussion of Russian folk music. You will hear that theme in various contrasting statements between the several tableaus that make up the work. The first of these tableaus describes Hartmann's drawing Gnomes, which represents a gnarled, limping dwarf moving grotesquely. This section is made up of three themes, the first of which begins as follows. Here is the second theme. The third of these themes most vividly describes the dwarf's painful, halting steps. Moussorgsky next treats a watercolor of Hartmann's called Il Vecchio Castello, or The Old Castle. This is an Italian landscape at night, with a troubadour singing before a mysterious villa. The mood is set in the darkest colors of the orchestra. The troubadour's song appears weirdly in the saxophone. The predominantly lugubrious and fantastic mood of these first two tableaus is relieved by the brightness of the third, which is called Tuileries. It is a representation of children on a frolic, quarreling and playing in the famous garden in Paris. One can almost see the brilliant colors of the balloons and dolls and pinafores of the children running about amongst the exquisite geraniums and poppies of the garden, and the brilliance of the bright sunlight caught in the starched whiteness of the nurses' uniforms, couched before the expressive gray of the buildings in the background. In the piece called Bidlo, Moussorgsky gives us a musical description of Hartmann's drawing of a lumbering, ox-drawn cart with enormous wheels. The fifth picture bears the title Ballet of the Chicks in Their Shells. Hartmann's drawing was a costume design for the ballet Trilby, in which the artist collaborated with the great choreographer, Marius Petipa. The sketch shows a dancer encased in an eggshell, arms and legs protruding through jagged holes, with a rather strangely enlarged baby chick's head emerging from the top. The drawing that inspired the next tableau, Samuel Goldenberg and Schmühle, does not survive. The musical representation is of a rich merchant and a beggar. It begins with a pompous phrase for the rich man. The beggar's pleas appear as follows. Now the two men, the merchant and the beggar, enter into a conversation. Goldenberg and Schmühle are succeeded by a scene called Limoges, Le Marché, the marketplace at Limoges. This piece describes chattering women as they go about their shopping in the city square. This rather flighty, fresh-sounding music is suddenly interrupted by ominous sonorities. This is Moussorgsky's realization of an eerie picture of Hartmann's called Catacombae Sepulchrum Romanum. It shows the artist himself examining the Roman catacombs in Paris by lantern light. Before continuing to the succeeding tableau, let us recall the promenade theme which opened the work. In the scene called Cum mortuis in lingua mortua, or with the dead in a dead language, that promenade theme will appear in a very different guise. It is in this piece that Moussorgsky's predilection for the fantastic, the grotesque, reaches its height. The composer wrote of this particular section that Hartmann's creative spirit leads me toward the skulls in the catacombs. He addresses them, and they gradually become illuminated from within. That weird light is, incidentally, suggested by the mysterious tremolos of the strings which surround the promenade theme. The tableau called The Hut on Bird's Legs is one of the episodes in which Moussorgsky transcends anything Hartmann attempted in his drawings. In the first place, the hut of the title is a dwelling of the legendary witch of Russian folklore, Baba Yaga. The fact that it is on bird's legs in the Russian folktale probably goes back to ancient memories of the Scythians, a violent nomadic people who lived on the shores of the Black Sea and built thatched huts on stilts as their temporary houses. Hartmann's drawing is actually nothing more than a handicraft design for a clock made in the shape of one of these huts. Moussorgsky, however, depicted the witch herself. The witch's chase appears as follows. Evil incantations by the sorceress are represented musically in this way. The closing tableau of the Pictures at an Exhibition, called The Great Gate of Kiev, is one which you heard earlier in this discussion. In its grandeur, it also exceeds Hartmann's original intention. The sketch is an architectural project for a gate to be erected at the city of Kiev to commemorate the thwarting of an attempted assassination of Tsar Alexander II. The gate was never built, but Hartmann's design was nonetheless hung in the retrospective show of his work, which fired Moussorgsky's imagination in the composition of this work. The scene begins as follows. There is one final consideration regarding pictures at an exhibition. Moussorgsky composed it as a solo piano work, and it became a successful one. The magnificent orchestral realization you hear on the performance record was prepared by Maurice Ravel in 1922 at the suggestion of the late Serge Koussevitzky, conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. To illustrate Ravel's genius in orchestration, let us return to the tableau called The Gnome for a moment, this time in the original piano version. Now listen to two successive orchestral embodiments of that passage in the Ravel version, the first using winds, plucked strings, and xylophone over snarling brass sounds. The repetition of that phrase gives us an entirely contrasting orchestral treatment in which the celesta, the harp, and sliding strings are prominent. One is justified in saying that, in Ravel's hands, pictures at an exhibition becomes a new composition. This is no mere arrangement, but a transformation of a piano piece into one which is essentially orchestral. The last example you heard illustrated the effect of a rather special kind of instrumentation. Let us listen to the way Ravel treats a simpler, more climactic phrase of Moussorgsky's, the closing pages of the episode, The Great Gate at Kiev. First, the original piano version. Now listen to the orchestral form that takes, leading to the brilliant conclusion of this massive work.